Hey everyone, welcome to Faith in the Fold, the podcast for ministry, biblical studies, and Christian living. I'm your host, Kevin Burr. Today's episode is part 2 of my interview with Dr. Dale Manor, Professor Emeritus of Bible and Archaeology from Harding University. In the first half of our interview, which debuted about 2 weeks ago, we talked about Dr. Manor's involvement in archaeology and what archaeology can and cannot tell us about the Bible. In today's episode, I posed the question to Dr. Manor: what's one thing you wish every Christian knew about the Old Testament? He and I talked about the nature of God, that the God of the Old Testament is the same as the God of the New Testament. We even dived into the murky waters of what God cannot do. Taking our cue from James chapter 1, God cannot be tempted by evil. On this basis, Dr. Manor and I talked about the necessity of Jesus' incarnation for saving humanity and some related issues as well. If you enjoy the kinds of conversations we're having on the podcast, would you be willing to like and subscribe to us? And maybe share us with someone that you think might benefit from this? And as always, thank you so much for tuning in today. Dr. Manor, is that the one thing that you wish every Christian would know about the Old Testament? When I had originally pitched this idea to you, I'd said, well, maybe we could go with this, but I love the route that we've gone because I think it's helpful for folks kind of to see maybe how someone like you, a very firm, committed Christian, but also firmly rooted in sort of the scientific exploration, archaeological exploration of the area, you're able to kind of look at these and say, okay, here's how we can kind of make sense of all this.
Well, most of your listening audience probably will never go into archaeology.
May
I suggest that you not?
I think that's fair.
There's not much money in this.
Yeah. It's great for a summer thing.
Yeah. I mean,
it was fun.
Yeah. You joined us one year and had a great time together.
Yeah.
But one of the things that bothers me, and this came up, it's not unique to now. Okay. This has been an ongoing concern from as far back at least as perhaps the 3rd century AD.
Oh,
I don't remember exactly the date of this guy. You would probably know. Marcion, I don't know how to pronounce his name. Who argues
Marcion,
that the God of the Old Testament is different than the God of the New Testament.
Right. Yeah. Kind of boiling down his view that there was a sort of a mean creator God who was lesser than God the Father of Jesus, according to Marcion. Yeah.
Is it Sion?
That's how I normally hear it pronounced.
Well, okay. Leave it to me to go with the Greek pronunciation and make it
or even Latin, right? Yeah.
Anyway, excuse me. But the argument that the God of the Old Testament is different than the God of the New, no, I do not. I think that is a terrible misunderstanding of the corpus of the Bible, Old and New Testament. Let me try to put some of this in perspective. At least my little peon view. Using archaeology as sort of a framework of reference here. When I go lecture at churches and places on archaeology and the Bible, say I have 6 lectures, 4 of them will deal exclusively almost with the Old Testament, and maybe 4.5 of them. And then I'll have 1 or 2 maybe on the New Testament. And there's some people that get sort of upset about that. Nobody's actually said anything to me overtly about it. But I try to sort of diffuse that. One, I am an Old Testament archaeologist.
Sure.
Okay. But secondly, the time frame
right
that the Old Testament, I mean, even from the time of Abraham, let's leave alone before Abraham stuff, which has its own set of problems.
Pick up in Genesis 12, right? And then go from there.
So if we go from Genesis 12 to the time of Jesus, we're looking at roughly 2,000 years. Whereas if you go from John the Baptist to the death of John the Apostle, you're looking at maybe 100.
Yeah.
And there's a sense in which the amount of material that you would have available potentially, even though it goes further and further and further back, the amount of material you potentially have available for the Old Testament is significantly greater and it's way more diversified than the amount of material you have for this 100-year period associated with Jesus and the apostles.
Yeah. One way to think about it is this: in the time span that the New Testament covers, for the area involved, right? Even taking into account all of Paul's travels in the book of Acts, there is one governing authority
that makes a world of difference
over the area. And around that time, during that time period, for that part of the world in question, right? For the area, for Judea and Galilee, and even Asia Minor and Greece, a lot of the places that Acts covers, relatively peaceful. Emphasis on relatively. One governing authority, relatively peaceful. That makes a world of difference compared with a significant number of regime changes, wars, things like that we see in the Old Testament.
Right. And all these factors become important components in how everything unfolds. Mm-hmm. So in our Bible, just sort of a quick and dirty calculation. Yeah. 3/4 of our Bible is Old Testament. Mm-hmm. 1/4 of it is New Testament. Yeah. There's been, in a sense, even a theological regime change, not regime change, a motif change. Okay. That has shifted from into the Old Testament into the New. And by that, I don't mean the God has changed. Okay. Right. But God has shifted from dealing with his people as a national entity in the world mm-hmm. to a theological entity whose citizenship is in heaven. Mm-hmm. From a theocracy on earth to, I'm not sure exactly what you would call us as Christians relative, but it's a theocracy based in heaven that has earthly implications, but God's people now are of all nations and languages and tribes and so forth.
And I've heard it described as a politic, but in a very carefully nuanced sense where if that makes sense to you, then as a politic, but not in the traditional sense where we normally think of politics as in political parties or something along those lines.
Now, and I think one of the problems, and admittedly, when we read casually, and I think this is part of the problem, we have a tendency to read too casually. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes with the freight of what we've heard all of our lives, sort of coloring how we look at this. And mm-hmm. and within certain parameters, it's difficult to escape.
Sure.
Okay. We talk about try to read this as if you've never read it before. Now, for some people, that is true.
Unfortunately. Yeah.
But for most of us, at least, who have sort of been raised in the church or been exposed in any kind of conservative church in particular, sure. For any duration of time, we've heard the stories, we've read portions of scripture and so forth and so on, and so it's not real easy to read it as if you've never read it before. Mm-hmm. So we bring that freight of understanding to the read. Yeah. And most of us have heard of, God's circumstances, go kill everybody in the land of Canaan. The directive given to Saul, go kill all the Amalekites. Mm-hmm. Don't save anything alive. We're familiar with David's improprieties.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
And so forth. And then we come to the New Testament, and Jesus is healing people, feeding people, saving people, and so forth. And it looks like there are two different dynamics going on here. Mm-hmm. Now, if we begin carefully and thoughtfully to read about the multifaceted character of God in the Old Testament, he is a God who, in the creation, makes the man and the woman in his image. Mm-hmm. I think this is critically important. In his image, in his likeness.
Mm-hmm.
And he gives them dominion. He gives them directives of how basically they're supposed to live. They have 3 commands they're supposed to follow, and they screw it up.
Yeah.
It's interesting God doesn't have to tell them be fruitful and multiply. That seems to be sort of. He later has to give directives. Okay, back off of this a little bit.
Right. Yeah. 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 That doesn't give you a license, Nimrod, to grab every woman you see, right?
Right.
Yeah.
The second command or expectation is to take care of creation, and we've done generally a fairly good job with that, but we need to make some correctives there.
Sure.
But the third one is, I refer to it as the George of the Jungle rule. Watch out for that tree. And they mess it up.
Right.
I mean, think in terms of what life would be if we only had 3 commands to follow. Wow.
Yeah.
I tell the students at Harding, we've got more rules at Harding than 3.
Right. Yeah. Have you looked at the student handbook recently?
This elicits all kinds of responses.
Yeah.
But God has breathed into their nostrils the breath of life. He shared his character with them. They're made in his image. And I often argue, look at these points of the dignity of the human being. 1, we're made in his image. 2, we share in his character. He breathed into our nostrils the breath of life. Thirdly, he cares for our well-being, that he creates a companion. Now, when God makes the woman to be a companion for Adam, she is not brought to him as an inferior.
Right.
The Hebrew very literally reads, he makes her according to his opposite. And I sort of liken it to, the deficiencies that are here, she makes up for here.
Yeah.
Not that there's anything intrinsically deficient, but God has intended these to be people who work together.
Yeah.
And it's not good that the man be alone. I will make him a helper according to his opposite.
That's the one thing that is pronounced not good.
I think that's the one thing
in the account.
And I don't think it's a matter of, oops, I made a mistake.
Right. Right.
I think, and the wonderful story, which regretfully is often just relegated to the children's classes. God brings animals by and he names them. Why does he do that? Is it because God doesn't know what to name them and he wants Adam to do it? No, he brings them by. It begins with, it's not good for man to be alone. Let me make a helper according to his opposites. And then you have the animals coming by. And then God creates the woman. And it's an issue. And Adam responds, wow, this is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. I think God is impressing upon Adam, you dipstick, you're here all by yourself. And he
that's
wants
in the Hebrew, right? You dipstick.
That's in the Hebrew. Yeah, that's the Hebrew translation.
Yeah.
And he wants to impress upon Adam that he is alone. In the meantime, he names the animals. But the naming of the animals is to impress upon him, you're here all by yourself, so that when he makes the woman, she will be a particularly valued individual.
Yeah.
Then the fourth point is God's visiting with him in the garden. He comes in the cool of the day. Now, the garden here is not a potato vineyard. It's not a vegetable garden. It's to be understood as sort of the classic European palatial grounds.
Right. This is a lavish area.
It's an area where people go to stroll away and communicate and have tea. And I often refer to it as God comes for afternoon tea.
Sure. Yeah.
And in the meantime, Adam and Eve have sinned in eating of the forbidden fruit. But God comes to have that formalized / informal relationship with them, but they've ruptured it. The God of the Old Testament implements a strategy by which to bring those people back into harmony with him.
Yeah.
And if a person reads carefully in the text, now there are some problematic areas, okay, but if one reads carefully the Old Testament, it will talk frequently about his love for his people, how kind he is to them in giving them and providing for them. Now, he has expectations. Now, when the children of Israel are brought out of Egypt and God establishes a covenant with them. Now, this is the word covenant is important here.
Mhm.
A quick and dirty definition that I would give of covenant is generically is an agreement between two or more parties, each of whom have responsibilities to maintain the agreement.
Mhm.
Now, those may be parity covenants where the two parties are of equal power and force, such
Mhm.
as we alluded to earlier, the Hittites and the Egyptians.
Yeah. Mhm.
Or they may be suzerain treaties where you have a person who is very, very superior in power, might, and so forth, and someone who can't really bring much to the table.
Right.
This is the kind of covenant agreement that Israel makes.
Mhm.
But God does not offer this covenant to Israel without any background. To the contrary, while the 10 plagues that are narrated in Exodus have as a significant target the gods of Egypt,
Mhm.
which, by the way, does not imply the gods of Egypt are real. Okay.
Right.
But as far as the people are concerned, they're real.
Yeah.
So God's sort of operating with them on the level of their comprehension.
Yeah. Paul gives us some hints in 1 Corinthians that that pagan gods are essentially demonic powers.
Yeah, but it certainly aren't on the level of him.
Absolutely, yeah.
But rather than trying to tell the Israelites, there aren't any other gods.
Right.
That's like trying to persuade something that is beyond its comprehension.
Sure. Yeah.
So you have to sort of get down on the level of what the person is able to grasp.
Right. The most important thing for the Israelites to know at that point was not a statement of theology about these other so-called gods or false gods. Yeah.
And so what you have is the 10 plagues are something that the Israelites in one way or another witness, if not experience.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the reason I say that is the text is clear that the first few of the plagues, all of Egypt suffered, but then there is a differentiation between where the Israelites live and where the Egyptians live. But you can bet that the Israelites were aware of what's going on over there.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And if nothing else, the Egyptians are going to let them know.
Right.
And then, of course, the last plague is the death of the firstborn,
mm-hmm.
for which the Israelites have to respond in some fashion.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Israelites are liberated, sort of. Okay. They're on their way. They get to the Red Sea. They complain. They whine. God opens the Red Sea. They walk across on dry ground. Then they start having problems with water and manna, and they encounter the Amalekites, and they defeat the Amalekites and finally come to Mount Sinai. And God is going to come down. Exodus 19 is just a fantastic chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Where God is going to come down. He says, put a boundary around this mountain. Don't let anybody pass this boundary. And if anybody does, kill them. And in order to kill them, you do not go after them because this is sacred. You shoot them with arrows or sling stones at them from a distance and execute them that way. But don't anybody pass this. If I were among the Israelites at that point, I would think, what in the world have we got into?
Right. Yeah.
So God is going to come down with thunder and lightning and darkness and noise and just mind shattering. And God tells Moses, you have the Israelites prepare for this. Don't let anybody approach this. I'm going to come down in this fashion because I'm going to talk to you, Moses, and I want them to overhear me talking to you.
Mm-hmm.
So that they will know that you are the spokesman. Mm-hmm. And of course, after all this happens, it's exactly how the Israelites respond. We don't want to hear him anymore. You take care of it. And God is happy for this. But then the rest of the book of Exodus is a strategy by which the tabernacle is the tent of meeting.
Right.
So God has to be approached with respect of who he is, but yet at the same time, he paves the way for a way to be a part and be one with him.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the point that I'm trying to make at this juncture is the covenant that they make is, I think, in Exodus 23 or 24, when God says, look at what all I have done for you. Will you be my people?
Mm-hmm.
And will you follow my rules? And they say, yes, we will. Well, this is the all-powerful God with evidence that he's provided. You have legitimate reason to understand who I am, and I can ask this of you. So it wasn't a whimsical kind of response.
Right.
10 plagues, crossing the Red Sea, water, manna, victory over the Amalekites, the witness of the mountain. They knew the power of God.
Mm-hmm.
So God has established a rapport with the Israelites in this covenant.
Yeah.
Now, from that point on, the problem tends to be Israel keeps failing the covenant. And it's sort of like someone who marries a spouse. And at that ceremony, yeah, we'll be faithful to each other as long as we both shall live.
Mm-hmm.
And the next week, one of them goes out and has an affair.
Yeah.
And God constantly is pleading with Israel to come back to him.
Mm-hmm.
But there are times when they won't, he has to punish them. Now, the fact that God is patient and pleading with them to come back. I mean, the book of Judges, while there's a lot of horrible things going on in the book of Judges,
Yeah.
The point is to try to get Israel to come back to him.
Right.
And, I've promised you that if you will follow me, then I will bless you. Your flocks will reproduce, your fields will reproduce, your families will reproduce. I will bless you, and you'll have harvest that will go into the sowing time of next year and your harvest of next season. You'll have more than enough. But if you don't follow me, this disparity, if you don't follow me, here are the consequences. And God was always upfront with them
Mm-hmm.
about the consequences.
Definitely one of the major thrusts of Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we have a tendency to read the Old Testament and collapse all of this into, all of this took place maybe in 100 years. No. Now, again, let's talk in terms of from Sinai to Malachi.
Malachi. Yeah.
Okay. From
Yeah.
Sinai to Malachi. So we're looking at roughly 800 years, 900 maybe,
Mm-hmm.
early date, maybe 1,000.
Yeah.
Okay.
1,000 is a comfortable.
And
round
that's
number.
workable.
Yeah.
That's 4 times the duration of the history of the United States of America.
Right. Right. And 10 times the amount of time that the New Testament covers in terms of years.
And the tirades that tend to come into play, such as Hosea and Amos and Micah, and then Jeremiah and Ezekiel, tend to come clustered at locations where things have gotten so bad,
Right.
that God is sort of at his wit's end to
Mm-hmm.
try to get them to straighten up. And even in those books, there is constantly the statement, if you read it carefully, if you'll come back to me, everything will be okay. Now, again, there's love and kindness and consideration, but there's also judgment.
Yeah.
Let's move to the New Testament real quick.
Right.
Jesus talks about hell more than he talks about heaven.
Yeah.
And when you get into most of the letters, Romans to the book of Revelation, there are significant chunks of those that have to do with the goodness and severity of God.
Mm-hmm.
The Hebrew writer will talk about it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God.
Yeah.
And the book of Revelation is judgment rendered against those who refuse to comply and live by God's will, whereas there's blessing to those who do. I mean, you have a continuation of the same kind of issues. Now, admittedly, the theological domains are different.
Mm-hmm.
In that in the Old Testament, it's a theocracy on earth,
Right.
dealing with a group of people who are supposed to be living and following God's rule here. Whereas in the New Testament, it is, my kingdom is not of this world. It is multiple languages and peoples and tribes and traditions and everything else. And it's a spiritual domain. We do not have, nor do we have the authority as God's people to be the political punitive measures.
Yeah.
That's politics. That's earthly stuff. Hence, you have no indication in the New Testament ever of legitimacy of church executing anybody. But there is judgment. Romans will talk about it. Corinthians will talk about it.
Right.
The pastoral letters, to one degree or another, will talk about it. Hebrews talks about it. Peter and Jude talk about it. Second Peter in particular. Second Peter and Jude. John talks about it in his letters. No, there is judgment. Now, I this is going to show up backwards, I think.
It looks right to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is God a moral monster? I highly recommend this book.
And that's by Paul Copan.
Paul Copan.
Copan.
I think that's how it's pronounced. But he addresses a lot of the new atheism. You know, Hitchens and Hawkins and
the late Christopher Hitchens. Yeah.
Yeah. Others will bring up all kinds of things. And he addresses a lot of those kinds of questions. Now, at this juncture, I'm working through the book. I'm not totally through it yet. Some of it, I think, I sort of scratch my head. I'm not so sure about that one. But he goes a long way in reasonably, as it comes back to sort of the pig bone issue. Okay. Here's his response. A believer can look at that and say, well, that makes sense.
Right.
A non-believer will look at it and say, that's malarkey. But this is the nature of evidence.
Yeah.
There is no evidence that is so compelling of anything that you are forced to believe it.
Jesus himself acknowledges that when he tells someone, even if someone comes back from the dead, they won't believe you. When he's talking, when he's giving the parable, even if someone comes back from the dead, they won't believe, which is a great bit of foreshadowing for what happens.
Sort of scary.
Yeah. I mean, think about the implications. Something as earth-shattering, well, in Matthew, literally, right? Earth-shattering as the resurrection.
Now, let me throw in one other thing, and I would be interested perhaps in hearing your take on this.
Okay.
One, as my opening premises, I think the God of the Old Testament, the God of the New Testament, the same God. Okay. The caricature of a monster God in the Old Testament and a loving God in the New Testament is based to a large extent upon selective passages.
Yes.
And ignoring the larger context. But I'm not sure exactly what to make of this. When Jesus, and it may be naivete on my part. Earlier I told you I'm not a theologian, but I'm trying to do some theology here.
We're heading into dangerous waters.
When Jesus comes to earth, now another footnote, proviso, I don't always know how to factor in certain things about God. I don't think anybody does. How do you factor in omniscience? How do you factor in omnipotence?
Yeah.
I mean, nobody can really get their heads around it,
Yeah.
in spite of some valiant efforts. And I don't mean to minimize those who wrestled with this.
Sure. Yeah.
But when Jesus becomes, when God becomes flesh and dwells among us, John 1, okay, I do believe there's still a Father in heaven.
Hmm.
Okay. I believe in the Godhead,
Right.
the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.
Hmm.
And so when Jesus becomes flesh, God becomes flesh and dwells among us. He then, after his life on earth, he becomes our advocate with the Father.
Mm.
Well, the idea of the advocate is a go-between. Paul and Timothy will refer to him as a mediator between God and man, himself man, Jesus Christ, man in this case being human. Okay. The issue of maleness that's not the point.
Sure. Yeah.
That is humanity. And there's a sense in which the deity of Jesus and his humanity serves as a two-edged sword. Or you could look at it as a bidirectional blessing. God cannot be tempted, James says.
Right.
Jesus was tempted. Now, some will argue that Jesus couldn't have been tempted because he was God. That misses the point here.
Yeah.
And I'll admit that I have some troubles with this, but
Sure.
I have to take it on the basis of what the point's supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
So, but Jesus overcame them, tempted at all points like as we are, yet without sin, the Hebrew writer will affirm. So in his role as a mediator, I envision it may be, and I emphasize the maybe. Okay.
Yeah.
Please don't make this is.
Right. Yeah.
It may be the case that the Father might not be able to understand what temptation is.
Interesting.
But his Son, who is God, who became flesh and was tempted, can now explain to the Father in terms that the Father can understand what temptation's like.
Yeah. I can see how that could make some folks uncomfortable because you start talking about what God can't do. But
the
we
Bible
would
does
all
say
affirm
he can't be tempted.
Yeah, James says it pretty clearly, and there's nothing within God to elicit any kind of tempting feelings. God cannot sin.
Now let me finish now.
Yeah.
Now the flip side of that is the person who argues, well, I couldn't help it to sin.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus then can come in and say, wait a minute, I know what it's like to be human. And you were too quick to succumb. You did not appropriately yield yourself to the will of the Father to overcome that temptation. And so Jesus bridging the Father and the human role intercedes with the Father on our behalf, but also serves as the judge of us as we try to weasel out of our own responsibility. And so maybe there's an element of the mediation of Christ hasn't changed God, but it puts the focus in a different emphasis.
Yeah.
Does that make any sense?
I think it does.
Now I'm probably going to get ripped to shreds by somebody.
Somebody might be kind enough to mention something in the comments. I don't know that I've ever heard of it put like this, where God can't understand or something along those lines, and that's how you worded it, right?
And it may be more accommodative than it is objective.
Sure. Yeah.
But there's a sense in which you can. There's a sense in which you can legitimately ask, okay, why?
For those of you who couldn't tell, Dr. Maynard's, for those who just listening, Dr. Maynard's phone started ringing, and it's the Raiders theme.
Raiders of the Lost Ark,
Right.
not the football team.
Right. No. Yeah, Raiders of the Lost Ark theme. Yeah. We were talking about something a lot more important than that. What were we talking about?
So why, and I don't know the answer to this. Okay. Mm-hmm. Why would Jesus need to function as a mediator between, as an advocate for us to the Father? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It may be accommodative. It may be to diffuse the argument of some that God can't understand me.
Right. Because through Jesus's experiences, he certainly does.
Right.
Yeah. I tend to go, when we start asking questions about Jesus's humanity and divinity and how all those kind of interact with each other, I tend to find myself gravitating towards Philippians 2, where Paul has this great discussion of what is technically termed kenotic Christology, this notion where Jesus empties himself. The Greek word kenosis there means an emptying of sorts, and hence we get our English word kenotic, where Jesus empties himself and takes up really what are limitations.
Yeah.
For someone who's still fully gone and fully man, he voluntarily takes up limitations on that. He's no longer omnipresent, right? He's no longer omnipresent.
I don't know what those limitations are, but yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's
a mystery. And I don't mean that in the sense that the New Testament uses the word.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So, let me quickly get to a couple of other sources.
I appreciate that.
Recommend.
Yeah. We can put a pin on that one and maybe come back at another time for another episode.
This set
by John Walton.
Yeah, John Walton. Zondervan Illustrated Bible Background Commentary. Now, there's a set for the Old Testament,
mm-hmm.
and there's a set for the New Testament.
Okay.
I'm showing you the Old Testament because this is primarily the framework
in
which our inquiry is pursued.
Right.
And it's very, very important to understand in these that these are not theological.
Right. That's not
They are background commentaries.
Yeah.
They're contextual commentaries.
Historical, geographical, cultural, things like that.
And some linguistic and literary from the standpoint of contemporary literature that might help us understand what's going on. Yeah. Now, the emphases that the individual authors bring to the respective texts will vary somewhat. Mm-hmm. For instance, Richard Hess, who does the part on Joshua mm-hmm. in this series, is much more ancient contemporary literature oriented.
Sure.
In his discussion.
Right.
Whereas, and be a little self-centered here, I, writing on the Book of Ruth,
right,
am more archaeological as well. I mean, Richard deals with archaeology, but I deal more with archaeology and less so with literature. He deals more with literature and less so with archaeology.
Sure. Right.
So each, and this is to be expected, but they're background commentaries.
Right.
And hence, for instance, in the New Testament set, in the book of Acts, they will talk about, let me see, I'm trying to remember the passage offhand. It's in the book of Acts, and it's talking about the curses and so forth, and things that are written.
Okay. Would it be Acts 19 where
the Ephesus?
Acts chapter 19, where they burned their magical papyri, basically.
Yeah.
Acts chapter 19.
What are some of those things,
right,
and how do we understand them? They're often referred to as the Ephesian letters, but has nothing to do with our book of Ephesians.
Correct. Yeah.
But those curses, and there's some really interesting background issues that help us better appreciate what all's going on. Now, on a certain level, we can understand them fairly straightforwardly, but the more these contextual things are brought to bear, one, typically, there's a sense in which we see the timelessness of the character of humanity. Secondly, it enriches the texture of the narrative, and sometimes even the doctrinal issues. And Copan, in his book, for instance,
is God a moral monster, right?
He talks about the argument that God is self-centered and because he wants people to worship him, and he's jealous. I don't know if you've ever heard this discussion. And he also talks about God's child abuse in having Abraham sacrifice Isaac. He does wonderful discussions of that are very reasonable. And contextually, he brings a lot of those issues. He talks about the argument about the Old Testament and its misogyny, its women hatred. And one of the points that he brings up is a contrast of what the Bible is doing contrary to what is going on in the Hittite and Assyrian and Babylonian world.
Right.
And there is typically a dramatic difference. Now, admittedly, it's not up to the level that we would look at from Western civilization.
Sure.
And one of the points that Copan makes is that, sort of like what I hinted at earlier, God is dealing with them sort of on a developmental level to bring them along to a level of maturity.
Right. And I think there's a really strong argument to be made that when you look at what the best of sort of what modern Western civilization offers in regards of treatment of women, emphasis on the best of what it offers, you can't get to this point without the developmental stages of a Judeo-Christian worldview.
No, I would agree.
I think that's a strong argument. There's a fascinating discussion or a series of discussions going on sort of in the podcast world with a gentleman by the name of Justin Brierley. He runs the Unbelievable podcast and has folks on like N.T. Wright and other folks on there pretty regularly to be in conversation with people who are non-believers or maybe non-traditional believers in some sense. And it's fascinating to hear people, historians who have no faith background or who long since neglect or rejected their faith background. They look back on sort of their writings of Roman history or something like that, and they realize, oh wow, this world of Rome is that I would have thought was my intellectual ancestor or something along those lines. It's actually very different. The kinds of things that we would experience, that one would experience, say, in pagan Rome, versus the kinds of things that were said about how one treats others, specifically women, children, slaves, etc. I mentioned those three groups because they show up in Ephesians, Colossians, and First Peter. The Judeo-Christian worldview gives us basically the foundations for that. And it's interesting to see these guys, either atheists or agnostics, come to recognize that sort of thing. It seems to be somewhat in line with kind of what we've been talking about just a second ago. Yeah. So it's God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan, and then the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Background Commentary. Specifically, the one you mentioned was the one for the Old Testament, edited by John Walton.
Yeah, the other is edited by Arnold, the New Testament counterpart.
Clinton Arnold, is that right? Okay, yeah.
That one's 4 volumes. The Old Testament was 5 volumes. They can be bought individually.
Okay.
They can be acquired fascically by book that you're interested in.
Yeah.
I don't know what they do with Ruth or Obadiah. They're so short.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're also available on ebook as well.
Cool.
So
yeah,
they can be accessed. I don't know if they're available on Accordance yet.
Yeah, I know with Accordance, they have at least the Bible background commentaries published by InterVarsity Press. So
Walton had a role in that.
Yeah.
But these
he did.
are significant expansions beyond that.
Cool. I've got the one. I use the one by the New Testament, the Bible background commentary on the New Testament, written by Craig Keener quite a bit. So anyway,
by the way, these have a lot of pictures.
yeah, definitely something that would be worth, say, like if you're at a church large enough to have a church library. Those would be the kinds of things that would go really well in a church library if you yourself found them either prohibitively expensive or you didn't need the whole set or something along those lines. Yeah, that would be great. Mom, if you're listening, check those out for the church library. Yeah. Dr. Manor, let me ask you one more thing related to kind of some resources, and I know we'll wrap up our time together today. John Walton has a series of books entitled The Lost World of, and then the following, either Genesis 1, Genesis 2, and I think a handful of others maybe. Have you read any of those? What do you think about them? If you have, would you recommend them? If you've read them, if you've not, then I guess it's moot.
I've read some of them, not all of them, and they're provocative. I mean that in a good way.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't necessarily agree with where he ends up on some of them.
Sure. That's fair.
I'm not sure about, to me, his Genesis 1 discussion, while I appreciate it as there's a sense in which it's sort of a restoration mindset.
Yeah.
Where he is attempting to argue that we need to look at this and interpret it on the basis of how the people to whom it was given would have understood it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot to be said for that.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure. In my mind, he's made his case.
Fair enough.
In the alternative discussion, I think he's sort of overdrawn it.
Okay.
Yeah. But certainly, it is sufficient discussion to give us pause.
Yeah.
And to be careful about dogmatism.
Agreed. So while not agreeing with all his conclusions, would you feel comfortable recommending it as this is a worthwhile discussion to at least be aware of?
Yeah, I would.
That's fair. Yeah,
I would. He's taking nothing away from the drama of the creation story.
Right.
And he's not. He argues that this is not addressing the issue of creationism,
right,
or evolutionism.
He's trying to. I think in some ways he's trying to make the case that Genesis 1 is not necessarily speaking to those issues.
Yeah, and I on a certain level I agree with him.
Yeah.
When it comes to the creation story, and when I say story, I'm not suggesting it's fiction.
Right.
Or not.
The
creation narrative.
Narrative. Yeah.
I believe that the book of Genesis, in a sense, is a book that was delivered to the children of Israel, probably at Mount Sinai, to orient them to who God is. Who is this God that has delivered us? And why are we out here? Because there seems not to have been sufficient time earlier to orient them to all of this. So they're sort of operating in not in a vacuum, but with a lack of ideal knowledge.
It seems like they know the patriarchs. And
yeah, they do. They knew something about their history.
There was, but like 400 years, right? So 400 years ago, we're thinking, King James, right?
Right.
400 years have passed. They have some basic knowledge, and there's still a lot of questions. Hey, we've been in slavery for a long time. What's going on here?
And one of the big issues is they've lived in a very polytheistic world.
Yes.
Their historical heritage roots are in a very polytheistic world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And these cosmogonies that characterize the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians and the Greeks although the Greeks are not in the picture yet, are very tumultuous.
Mhm.
Chaos. I mean, multiple gods fighting and fussing with each other,
Yeah.
and there is duplicitousness, uh, killing, and all kinds of things. And the dignity, that's again the contrast, the dignity of the creation's account stands in dramatic contrast
Yeah.
with all of the others. And the point is, all that you see here is the result of a God who created it all. And it was all good,
Right.
not chaotic. I mean, while there is without form and void right at the beginning,
Right.
that's a different issue than the chaos and
Right.
fueling and fighting and dueling that characterized the Egyptian and Mesopotamian worlds.
Let me comment on that just for a second, because I don't want folks to miss that. When you mention formless and void, that is typically how our English translations describe what the Spirit of God is hovering over there in Genesis 1. Spirit of God is hovering over the waters, and the earth was formless and void. One way I've heard some folks describe that is maybe a better way of translating that would be something like wild and waste. So imagine a desert, right? If there's stuff out there, sure, like you might have a dead tree or some rocks and a bunch of sand, but in another sense, there's nothing there. There's nothing there. And so
Functionally,
exactly, yeah, functionally,
functionally, I would compare it, for the purposes of what's going on, to watching my wife make bread.
You have all this stuff,
all this stuff that's randomly here,
right?
And she then puts it together, and it looks like a mess at the start.
Yeah.
And she brings it into fashion.
And then afterwards, it is good.
Right. It is good.
Yeah. But that's so when you talk about chaos in Genesis chapter 1, the waters here are chaotic in a sense, meaning there's no order, there's no order, there's no peace, there's no beauty, there's no goodness here.
Right.
It's just we have this compared to these other ancient Near Eastern accounts where the chaos is warring gods and destruction and things like that.
Right.
It's very different.
Very different.
Dr. Manor, I have greatly appreciated our time.
It's an honor to be asked.
Yeah. And I suspect that what I'll end up doing is I'll trim this episode to be kind of a two-parter because we covered a lot. And we were expecting to go for about an hour. I'm looking at about hour 2 right now, and so I enjoy the conversation, especially the beginning stuff about kind of how archaeology works. Hearing from someone like yourself, who is a recognized archaeologist, not just in Church of Christ circles, but folks who especially know the archaeology of Israel and need to run across Tel Bet Shemesh at any point, they have run across your name. And so, Dr. Manor, if you could tell us just one more thing briefly, kind of wrap us up. Could you give a plug for the Archaeology Museum there at Harding University in Searcy, Arkansas? Can you tell us just kind of briefly about what that is and maybe encourage folks to go check it out?
Okay, at about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, we began Museum of Biblical Archaeology. It's the Linda Bird Smith Museum of Biblical Archaeology. She is the one that funded its creation.
Mm-hmm.
And the artifacts in it, almost all of them in one way or the other, relate to the biblical world. Mm-hmm. It is not intended to be, a museum of
right
Aztec archaeology or Native American, not to denigrate those at all, but it's a biblical archaeology museum. And most of the items that are in there are authentic. Some of them are replicas and reproductions, although I try when I have those to have reproductions that are reasonably realistic, not just, stamped out of a cereal box. I have some reproductions from the British Museum, for instance, of the Taylor Prism and of Cyrus Decree and so forth. Very well done. and it's free. It doesn't take a lot of time. There are about 100 items on display in the museum, and we change part of it at least every couple of years or so, so to keep it sort of fresh. At this point, two of the interesting things are a Greek helmet reproduction and a Roman centurion helmet.
Very
and
cool.
in the next rendition, Lord willing, we will have a full Roman centurion armor, full size. So that ought to be fun.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Manor, again, thank you for your time this morning. I appreciate it, sir, and look forward to be able to publish this, and hopefully some folks their interest in the Old Testament will be piqued, and they'll be able to realize, or maybe realize more than they had, that the Old Testament really is worth digging into, and like you said earlier, not just casually reading it, for the fun stories or Sunday morning Bible lessons for the kids, but really digging into it to see and understand the character of God, because that same God is the Father of Jesus Christ. So, Dr. Manor, take care, sir.
God bless you. Thank you.